This is Photoshop 101. So I'm going to assume that you don't generally know anything about Photoshop, but at the same time, I'm going to assume that you know something about your computer and other things. So I'm not going to, start you at 101 when it comes to absolutely everything. But what we're going to do is we have 3 days here, and I'm going to try to concentrate a bit on working on projects where instead of touring the interface and saying, now we're going to look at every single preference that exists in all of Photoshop, that's not the most exciting thing to do, and most of the time you don't need everything if you are just touring the interface. So instead we're going to be looking at how do we use Photoshop for projects. And in the process of doing so, we'll learn more and more about Photoshop throughout 3 days. But each time, hopefully it'll be something that's actually usable that we're working on, instead of creating something just for the sake of talking about a feature. And you'll find that I use more projects on the second day, though, on the first, because on the first day there are some things we do just need to get out of the way, and can't always associate with a project. So what we're going to do is today we're going to concentrate on adjustments, because usually before I end up using my images in some sort of a project, I need to make sure they look good. And so we'll concentrate today on adjustments. We'll start off using a part of Photoshop called Adobe Camera Raw, just because that's where most of my images first get adjusted. Then we'll pop into Photoshop and we'll get used to using what's known as an adjustment layer and how to isolate areas within a picture. So if I want to just brighten somebody's face instead of the whole photo, that type of thing, you'll know how to do so. On the second day, we're going to get more into layers. And that means if you have an image that's going to be made out of more than one part, if it's more than one photograph you're trying to combine together, or maybe it's more than one version of the same photograph. Like I took one that was dark, I took one that was bright, but it's the exact same photo. And I want to put those two photos together as one. I'm going to need to use layers most of the time to do that. And so tomorrow we're going to concentrate a lot on layers. And part of that will be projects where if we need to create like a wedding invite or a just married announcement or something like that, so that as a photographer, if that happens to be what you do, you're not just delivering straight photographs, but you can do something with those photographs to kind of add more value to them and possibly get hired for more things. So we'll be getting into layers quite a bit on the second day. On the third day, we'll talk more about retouching. So if you need to remove anything from a photo or fix something that's wrong with it, you'll know how to do that, and we'll explore more of the creative uses of Photoshop. So filters, and if you want your picture to look a little bit more like a painting or something else, we might cover that on the third day. So, but anyway, today we're going to concentrate, like I said, on adjustments. And what I've done here is I've reset Photoshop's preferences. Both Photoshop and Bridge. Bridge comes with Photoshop, so that it should look like you just installed it for whatever it is I do. And that's what I'll just assume that you have. If you don't, I'll try to steer you how you'll know how to get to where I am. And I'll show you how I'd like to customize Photoshop just to get it to be the most convenient, that type of thing. But in general, I want to jump in and start adjusting pictures relatively quickly. So first off, if I want to open images, I'm going to usually do so through Bridge. Now, Bridge comes usually with Photoshop. If you install Photoshop, one of your options is to also install Bridge. You don't have to buy it separately. It comes with it. And I'm going to go to Bridge. I have it launched right now. And usually in Bridge, on the left side is where you navigate your hard drive. And so over there, I have two different tabs. I'll zoom up on that, get it a little easier for you to see. I can go to my folders or my favorites. Since we haven't set up any favorites yet, this will have some generic choices in it, like going to your desktop, documents, or pictures folder. But we can put whatever we want over there in our favorites. If there's a folder where you typically keep your images, you can store it over there in your favorites. Otherwise, you can click over here on folders, and this should be a list of what's on your hard drive. So in my case, I happen to have my files stored on my desktop, and there's just a little triangle next to it. I can expand it and navigate to whatever folder I would like. And so it just reflects the structure of your hard drive, and there's nothing I need to do to get my images to be recognized in here, because this is just like being in your operating system and navigating your hard drive. The difference is when I click on a folder on the right side in the middle of my screen, I'm going to see previews of all my images. We might call those thumbnails. And if I want to change the size of those previews, I have really two general methods for doing so. At the very bottom edge of my screen is a slider bar near the bottom right. And if I grab that little slider bar and slide it to the right, the previews will get larger, slide them to the left, and they're going to get smaller. But I personally never use that slider bar, just because it's inconvenient for me to always have to move to the bottom edge of my screen, and it doesn't feel all that precise moving it around. So you can often use a keyboard shortcut, and the keyboard shortcut that I use is to hold down the Command key in a Macintosh. That's the Control key in Windows. And then you can press the plus or minus keys on your keyboard. And if I do Command plus, it will zoom up to make the thumbnails larger. And if I do Command minus, it will zoom out to make them smaller. And it does it just the right amount where it fits precisely the number of images across the screen. So when I type Command plus, if I had 5 images across the screen, now I'm going to have 4. If I hit it again, I'll have 3, and so on across the screen. Whereas using that slider bar, you'll get like halfway in between certain sizes, and it like where it's inefficient in its layout. So I usually do Command plus and minus, but some people just don't use Photoshop enough where you don't remember keyboard shortcuts. And if so, then head down to the bottom, use your slider bar. But once you get used to it, you can do Command plus and Command minus instead. Now, what I'd like to do in here is, first off, these images all have the file names that came from the camera. And I try to stay away from those file names because eventually your camera will reset itself and start off numbering with 0 again. And if you end up shooting for years and years, you're going to have a whole bunch of photos that will have the exact same file names in multiple folders on your hard drive. And if you ever start working on a project where you happen to want to, let's say, create a portfolio of images, and you're going to grab from more than one folder and drag them somewhere else, like to email to someone else, suddenly you might have some files that have the same file name. Or if somebody tells you, I really liked the file that has this particular file name, would you please send me a larger version of it? And you go and search for that file name, there might be 10 versions of it because you use the generic file names from your camera and it resets to 0 after a certain amount of time, a certain number of pictures. So I always try to give mine unique names. To do that in Bridge, you could come over here and click on the file name that's just underneath the thumbnails. And if you click on it, it should highlight the file name, and you could type in something new. And then you can click on the next one and do the same thing. If you wanted to do that for a large number of images, you could type in a name here, press the Tab key. It would send you to the next picture, and you could just type in another name, hit Tab again, and just cycle through them all. I mainly would do that if I just created like a portfolio of images for a client, and I want the file names to be more useful for them compared to what I might use for myself, where I have more images to deal with, so my file names might be a little more structured. But if these just came off the camera and I want to name them for me, what I would do to rename them all is first I need to select them all. So there's a bunch of different ways we can do that, but if you go to the Edit menu, there's a choice in there called Select All. And use it so often that you'll get used to the keyboard shortcut. The keyboard shortcut is Command A. And I should mention for those of you that use Windows, this is the command symbol on a Mac. If you ever see it on my screen, that's what it looks like when I say the Command key. And the equivalent on Windows is the Control key. It's easy to remember because Command and Control both start with the letter C. So Command, Control, same thing. Also on the Mac, just so you know, there's an Option key, and it's the equivalent to the Alt key in Windows. So if I ever mention Option, it means Alt in Windows. I'll try to mention that every time, but if I ever slip up and happen to not, Option always means Alt. So I can either go to the Edit menu and choose Select All, or I can type Command A to get them all selected. Then if I want to rename them, I can go to the Tools menu. And up there, I'm going to find a choice. The very first one is called Batch Rename. And that just means rename a whole bunch of images. So it's under the Tools menu called Batch Rename. Now it's only going to rename those files that we currently have selected. So you have to be careful that you don't just have a few images selected. That's why we chose Select All first. Come over here, choose Batch Rename, and this comes up. Now at the very top, you have a choice for presets. So if you rename your files constantly using the same general formula for how to rename them. You could create a preset that you come back to time and time again, but we're not going to be doing that right now because we haven't learned to rename yet. Below that, we have to tell it where to put these files. This choice, rename in same folder, is just going to leave the files exactly where they are and just change their names. I could instead tell it to move it to another folder. I might use that if I had copied my images to, let's say, my desktop when I was in the field shooting, and now I just got home. And I no longer want them on my laptop. I want them on a hard drive that's external. That's where I store all my files. So I could tell it, instead of renaming it sitting right here on this hard drive, my internal drive, I could say move it to a folder on a different drive, maybe one that's an external that I store all my files on. Or I can choose copy to another folder, and therefore I would have two versions of it. The original one still sitting there with the original file names, and then these copies. And that I might use if I have the files on this particular hard drive. I'm about to give them to a client, but I want the clients to have a different file name. I don't want theirs to have like the client name and other things. I want it to be more useful names for them, but I don't want it to mess up my master folder of things. So I'm just going to make a copy in a different folder. But for us, we'll rename in the same folder. If you choose one of the other two options, there'll be a button below that called Browse, and you can browse your hard drive to tell it where you would like it to copy or move the pictures to. Below that here, we have an area where we can create kind of a formula for how to construct a name. And we have many different choices on how to do this. Right now, it shows us a total of 4 fields. That's because it assumes I'm going to type in the name of a project, like maybe a particular person's last name and then the word wedding. And then it's going to insert the date, a dash, and then a number, where it'll just number the files. Most of the time for me, I end up having pretty simple setups here. And on the right side, you'll find a plus and a minus button where you can simplify the formula used to make the renaming by hitting the minus sign here to get rid of choices. Or if you find it's too simple of a formula, you can hit the plus sign and it'll add more of these choices, just kind of stack them up. So for me, I'm going to just name this first field Beat Shoot. I'm going to hit the space bar so that if it numbers my files, the number doesn't bump right up into the file name. And then down here, if I want to have it just number my pictures, that's called a sequence number. And so a sequence number means it'll just start with whatever number you tell it to and just add 1 to it for each subsequent file. And the number that's down here means what number should it start with. What'll happen is the next time I use batch rename, it will type in whatever number it ended in last. So if I rename this folder happens to have 97 pictures, so the last number it's going to add is 97. Next time I use this, the number in that field would be 98, because it's assuming I might add to this folder, and I just need to rename what's freshly added. I find that to be annoying most of the time, because I'm constantly selecting it and hitting the number 1, because I want it to, most of the time, start fresh. Over on the right side, then, it asks me how many digits. And before I choose that, I can look just outside of this dialog box at Bridge. You'll see Bridge behind it, and in the lower left of Bridge, you'll find some numbers. And it'll tell you right now there's 97 items in this particular folder, and 97 of them are selected, meaning we're going to rename 97 pictures right now. And so that tells me I can get away with a 2-digit number on the end. We're not going to end up maxing out that number and having it to reset to 1 again. So if you just glance down there, you can determine how many digits you might need on the end, or you can just standardize. Most of the time, it's rare for me to shoot more than 9,999 pictures in a shoot. It's just, I'm not that prolific of a shooter. And so I could just standardize on 4 digits and use it every single time I ever do it, and therefore you don't have to think. So it's up to you. Let's just look at a few of the choices that are available when you rename. If I click on this little pop-up menu, we have a couple options. We can start with the current file name. So if the file name's already great and you just want to add on to it, maybe the add-on you're going to add is going to be the word retouched or updated or whatever it is that you want to be different. You could start with the current file name, and then the next Part of your formula would be some text. That would be whatever you're adding to the current file name. You can do a sequence letter. So instead of having the files numbered, it can be lettered A, B, C, D. You can put in the date, what name of the folder it's in, that type of thing. There is one choice in here that's special. It's called string substitution. And what it really means is search and replace. So that let's say that you just renamed an entire folder of images, perfectly named with some complex name structure that has the date on it, the client name, some number on the end, and all that, and you realize you mistyped the client's name, and it'd be an embarrassment to send the files over there with the wrong name in it. Well, with string substitution, it will allow you to type in a before and an after for part of the file name. So I could say search for a guy named Sean, and I spelled it one particular spelling, and I'm going to replace it with the actual spelling they use, because they use something different than I assumed. So anyway, that's the type of choices you'll find in there. And then down here, there's a choice that's called Preserve Current File Name in XMP Metadata. XMP metadata is text that's attached to your picture that you usually don't see unless you look for it using a tool like Bridge. And that's where you have things like your shutter speed, your aperture setting, what camera model this was shot with, the date it was shot, all that kind of stuff, where it's just text related to the picture that's not actually part of the picture itself. That's what metadata means. And so the time I would turn this on is if I ever took notes when I was shooting. Let's say I'm shooting with my camera, I have a notepad with me, I'm done shooting one child for a photo shoot, and I grab my notepad, I write down the last file name on my actual camera when I review it, and then I write the kid's name next to it. And then I continue shooting, and before I'm done, I write down the end of the next sequence of images, whatever the file name is that I actually see in my camera, and then I write down what the subject matter was there. I might want to keep those original file names that are usually overly generic, not overly useful, and that's where I might do it, is just turn that on. Then there's a way within Bridge where we could review that and actually see the original file names. Otherwise, 98% of the time, if I'm not taking notes, I don't care about the file names from my camera because they just weren't important. If you turn on these little checkboxes for compatibility, it will simply limit what kind of text you can use up here so that it's compatible with these operating systems. If there's special characters that they don't support, that type of thing. And it'll have grayed out whatever operating system you're on because it's got to be compatible with yours. It's on your hard drive. And then finally at the bottom, it's going to tell me that this is an example of a file name, usually the first one that's in that folder. And the construction you've made up above, that little formula for a file name, this is what it would end up renaming it to, just so you can double check that you're really getting what you're thinking of. Most of the time what you'll notice down here is you forgot to put a space on the end if you wanted one before any kind of sequence number it put in, that type of thing. Then I'm going to just hit the rename button. And when I do, it'll just take a second, and now all of my images are renamed. And so I try to do that where I use a unique name for each photo that I shoot, and oftentimes I end up having the date of the shoot at the beginning just because sometimes I return to the same subject matter over and over again, and I might not realize I have another folder that I called Beach Shoot because I might go to the beach more than once. So oftentimes I have the date at the beginning, which will usually be at least year and month, then a descriptive name for whatever the shoot was, and then a number. And therefore, most of the time, I'm not going to end up with any duplicates. And therefore, if I ever put together a portfolio 10 years from now, combine photos into a particular folder, give them to a client, and they say, I really liked this file, and they give me the file name. There's only one file on my entire hard drive that matches that, and so it's easy to keep track of. All right, so in Bridge, remember on the upper left, that's where we have the choice called Folders. This is where we navigate our hard drive to wherever it is we want to view our images. And all we're doing is clicking on these little triangles to expand or collapse the folders to see subfolders. And when I click on the particular folder I would like to view, that's when I see my thumbnails in the middle. Also, just above that is what some would call the path bar. And that means immediately above, it will tell you the path you needed to navigate to get to this particular folder. So if you started on your computer, then this is the name of my hard drive. And if I was actually in my operating system manually navigating, this is the path I would need to take to get to this folder. What's nice about that is if you ever want to go back a level, just kind of back out of your hard drive a bit, you could click on one of these folders like this one, and it'll back you up that far, as if you navigated your hard drive. So you don't always have to deal with the structure that's on the left side to do it. You can instead just come in here, and if you see folders you want, just double click on the big folder icons here to navigate, and then this tells you where you are. And if you want to go back a bit in your navigation, just click on one of these folders to the left. Now what I'd like to do is imagine I literally went out and did a beach shoot here with some horses running on the beach. And I want to edit them down because I don't want to process every single picture. We have 97 pictures. Think about how much time it would take to process 97 images. What I want to do is think about how can I most effectively narrow these down to just those worth processing, and how I might think about, should I delete any of them? How do I know which ones are the best for being processed? That type of thing. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to click on an image, and when I do, in the upper right I'll see a preview. Now at this time the preview is pretty small. That's just because we have a relatively small screen. Usually I have a screen that can show much more information, and this would be larger. But in Bridge, each one of these areas, each one of these kind of panes that are in Bridge, have a little divider bar. Do you see like a vertical bar between the preview and the thumbnails that are here? If you click on that little divider bar, I'm going to grab it right here, you can drag and expand out to enlarge any particular area of Bridge. And so if I make that preview area wider, and I grab the horizontal divider bar right below it and make it taller, I can get that preview to be relatively large. And if I'm done navigating my hard drive on the left side, and I don't really need it to take up space over here, I can grab the vertical divider bar that is just on the right edge of it, click on it and just drag that over and say, I don't want you to take up much space. I can even drag it all the way to the edge so that you can't even see what's there. If you want to get that area back, the divider bar is still there. And you can just click on it, pull it back, and you'll see that area show up again. The other thing that I can do with these little panes that make up Bridge is I can collapse down certain parts of them. So over here we have my folder structure in the upper left, and just below it are some other choices, something called a filter and collections, which we haven't talked about yet. And if I find that taking up too much space, I would rather see my hard drive's navigation there. I can go to the name of any one of these panes and just double click on it. When I double click, it'll collapse it down so all you see is the little tab. And if I come down and double click on it a second time, it'll expand it again. Just be careful if you change from different screen sizes. On occasion you'll find that this seems to get stuck down at the bottom, where you double click on it and it just seems to sit there. And if that ever happens, it's the equivalent to this being expanded, as if you're actually using it, and you grab the divider bar to pull it down like this. And you just happen to drag it down so that all you see is the tab. And it thinks that that's the expanded version. You know, you only allowed it that much space. So now when I double click, it just collapsed it down. I double click again and it seems like it doesn't do much. And that's just because you got to pull that up. You can actually tell if it's truly collapsed or not. If you zoom up, well, you can't zoom up. Just get your face closer. Do you see this there's this microscopic little double bar right there? That's like supposed to be a gripper. If that's there, it means that you can pull on it to resize it. If it's not, like when I collapse this, I'll zoom up on the same area. Can you tell there's no little double bar there? That means there's no grabber. There's no something to grab. So if you double click on this, and double click doesn't seem to be doing anything, but those little bars show up and disappear. When they show up, it means you can pull on it. When they're not there, it means it's truly collapsed. It's a weird kind of odd thing in Bridge in general where that can happen. It happens to me all the time, because what will happen is I'll teach on a big screen, like a 27-inch external monitor, and I'll come here to teach where I'm just using the internal screen, and it gets confused because it used to have a huge window and now it's on a small screen, and it acts as if I've shortened those things up. So when I double click on them, it doesn't seem to do anything. And so I just wanted to mention that. If you happen to not be able to pull on it, double click on the name and you'll suddenly be able to pull on that. So if I want to get rid of some of these areas, like I want my preview to be nice and big, I can get rid of this area at the bottom that says metadata and keywords by double clicking on the name of one of those tabs, and it'll collapse it down, making more space for my preview. But that preview on the side, I don't use that much. I find that oftentimes I like the thumbnails to take up a lot of space, and so sometimes I'll drag the divider bar all the way to the right to get rid of that side. So I can really concentrate now on navigating my hard drive on the left side and looking at these thumbnails on the right side. Then, in order to really see my images, there's a trick. There's a keyboard shortcut. If you press the space bar, anytime you press the space bar, it'll take whatever image you currently have selected, and you just click once on the image you want selected. If you hit space bar, it'll make it fill your screen. You hit spacebar again, it just sends you back. So spacebar is kind of a toggle for full screen or back to whatever you had before that. When you hit spacebar, so you're looking at it full screen, you can then use the arrow keys on your keyboard to navigate between the images. So if I hit the right arrow key on my keyboard, it'll go to the next picture, and so on. And when you're in this view where you're viewing it full screen, it doesn't matter if you hit the right or left arrow keys to navigate or the up and down ones. They'll do the same thing. Whereas if I was out of this, it would matter, because the down arrow would send me down in the grid that's here, and left and right would send me left and right, which would be quite different. But when you're viewing only one image at a time, it doesn't matter. Up and down arrows is the same general concept as right or left arrows. It just means next or previous image. So I'll hit my space bar there. And now I can go through and cycle through these images that were shot at the beach. But I want to know, how can I narrow them down so I don't have to process 97 images?